GMAT Club for a webinar. Today we are talking about the executive assessment, and we're going to walk you through how to understand what a good score is for top EMBA or executive MBA programs, as well as top full-time programs. Increasing numbers of full-time programs are taking the executive assessment, so we will talk about what a good score is for each of those categories. It does vary by the program, so EMBA versus full-time MBA. Just to tell you a bit about, well, first of all, we do want to invite you to like our video at the end. If you have found this very useful, please like our video so we can make plenty more for you. And then just a bit about our company. My company has been giving advising for over 30 years. We predate all the top EMBA programs, which means that we have been working with each of those programs successfully for over those 30 years. And we've placed students in all the top EMBA programs, so we do understand the nuances. If you come to our company, you're able to work directly with me, and you'll notice that we do have very reasonable pricing. We would love to give you a profile evaluation. So if you would like to understand how we think about your candidacy and whether you will be a strong candidate to an executive MBA or a full-time program, feel free to send us your LinkedIn profile, a recent resume, or fill out our profile evaluation form on our website on the homepage. So let's start from the beginning. What is the executive assessment? So GMAT, the makers of GMAT, responded to the need for a test that would require little preparation and be targeted to seasoned professionals who were thinking about attending an executive MBA program. What the top schools found is that these seasoned professionals did not have time to stop and prepare for the GMAT or GRE because they were so busy with family responsibilities and advanced responsibilities at work. And so typically, years back before the EA, a seasoned professional would only be able to manage a GMAT score of 610, 600, which is quite low. And so the schools were not getting the information they needed. They needed to know, was this professional ready to take on an MBA program? Did they have the skills in place? And so GMAT designed the executive assessment test to require less preparation and be there to test whether the skills are in place to embark on an executive MBA program. And so the test is 90 minutes long. It's shorter than GMAT and GRE. It's offered year-round. It's offered at plenty of centers, so 600 locations around the world. You're able to take it fast. And so if you book it, usually you can test within 24 hours of booking online. And then presumably it takes less time to prepare. So GMAT claims that you should be able to prepare for it within 4 weeks or 30 hours. And so these are the advantages of this test. So let's talk about structure and content. There are 3 sections, 30 minutes each, and there's 40 questions in those 3 sections. So the 3 areas are integrated reasoning, verbal reasoning, and quantitative reasoning. Each of those scores for each of the sections goes from 0 to 20. They're weighted equally. And then the final score that you get for the overall exam ranges from 100 to 200. If you go to the GMAT website, so it's mba.com, they will break it down for you. And so you'll get more of a sense of this, but this is essentially what you will see. And so they give a little bit more detail about what is in each of the sections. So when they say integrated reasoning, they mean basically data. Can you interpret things from multiple sources and reason well? Can you interpret graphs? Can you do table analysis? With verbal reasoning, there are topics such as reading comprehension and sentence correction. With quantitative reasoning, there's things such as data sufficiency. So let's talk a little bit more about pros and cons of the executive assessment. So it is easier to score higher on the EA. That is what I've seen very clearly through my candidates who've taken the executive assessment and also the GMAT. They generally do better on the executive assessment. It requires less preparation time, which I think most people would appreciate, to have to spend less time studying for a standardized test. Each attempt is reported separately, and that is an advantage because if you take a first score and you don't do well, then you can take it a second time or third or fourth and only send forward the best score. And so that's a benefit for you in the admissions process. GMAT materials do help you prepare for the executive assessment. So sometimes people have started to prepare for the GMAT and then they decide, hey, let me take the executive assessment. The good news is that generally the practice that you've been doing does translate. Cons is that you only have 4 tries. And so there's a limited number relative to the GMAT and GRE. So you don't want to test when you're not ready because you don't want to squander your tries. You're able to do 2 in a center and 2 online. You cannot cancel a score, but at the same time, you don't have to forward a score that is not good. And then candidates from overrepresented profiles are sometimes at a disadvantage if they do present an EA score in the full-time pool. And I will talk to you a little bit more about that in the presentation as we progress here. So which of the top executive MBA programs accept the EA test? Essentially all of them now. So this is a big movement. So since this was introduced in 2016, you've seen essentially all of the top programs that require a standardized test, they take the executive assessment. Now, not all executive MBA programs require a standardized test. So places like MIT, so not MIT Sloan Fellows, that does require a test, but MIT, the regular EMBA program, does not. And places like Kellogg, they do not also require a standardized test. But for those that do require it, most of the top EMBA schools now take the executive assessment. In the full-time pool, the list is much shorter. And so here's some of the top ones that currently are accepting the executive assessment. And so there's a lot of great schools that are not on this list: Harvard, Wharton, Stanford. So you still do have to consider the GMAT if you're looking at schools outside of this list. I did want to give you the link to keep checking because things do change. And so next year, if a different school decides that they're going to start taking the test, you should check this link to see what are the current schools accepting the executive assessment. So a question people have once they hear about the executive assessment is, well, do the top executive MBA programs prefer the GMAT over the EA? And the question is absolutely not. And so this test was designed for the executive MBA pool. And so it is testing for exactly what the schools want to know. Do they have the skills in place to tackle the curriculum at the executive MBA level? So someone will sometimes ask me, well, I have a low GPA, so I think I should take the GMAT because it's harder and therefore I'll prove my skills in the executive MBA pool. It's really not going to give you an advantage to take the GMAT because the executive assessment, again, was designed for this pool. And so there's no more advantage to getting a high GMAT score than getting a high executive assessment score in this pool. And so I do advise candidates not to do the GMAT if, there's really no reason to. It's so much more work. And what I do see is that a lot of executives, because they're so busy, they just cannot take the time to study properly for the GMAT. And so they'll spend time and end up with a poor score, like a 610 or 620. And so they really wasted their time. The executive assessment is just a better test at this point for the executive pool. And then, so I always do say, yes, unless you need a GRE or a GMAT score for a different type of program, like a master's degree in a different field, there really is no advantage to take the GMAT or GRE over the executive assessment in the executive MBA pool. So very specifically for that pool. When it comes to the full-time programs, do the schools prefer GMAT over EA? I would say as of now, February 2024, yes, they do prefer the GMAT and GRE over the executive assessment. And that's because the function is somewhat different. In the executive pool, they're just trying to establish that you have the skills and will be able to get through the program, the curriculum, and you're not going to struggle. In the full-time pool, that's a component of it. But if anything, a bigger part of it is who has earned their way into the school with a strong academic profile. So that includes GPA and GMAT or GRE. And so because the GMAT is in general a harder test, if you do better on that, GMAT or GRE, it kind of means more to the full-time admissions folks than doing well on the executive assessment would. And so the question is, when would you take the executive assessment in the full-time pool? Sometimes people just cannot get a strong GMAT or GRE score. And so in those cases, the executive assessment is better to present a strong executive assessment than a very bad GMAT or GRE score. And then also, if you have a really strong undergraduate GPA, then the schools will be more comfortable with where your skills are And so in that case, the executive assessment would be less risky. I did mention before that sometimes people who are overrepresented, like the profile is overrepresented in the admissions pool, may be disadvantaged by putting forward an executive assessment in the full-time pool. So that includes people like men from East Asia or South Asia, so men who will be considered foreign nationals in the admissions process, because the schools do know it's an easier test. And so a higher GMAT score will mean more in the admissions pool and application process than a high EA for that particular candidate, which is overrepresented. So just to remind you again about the scoring. So 3 sections, the raw scores are 0 to 20 for each section. Overall weighted scores 100 to 200. And so the question, of course, is, well, what is a strong overall score? One question I often get is quant the most important? And yes, quant is the most important. In the executive MBA pool in particular, most of the schools are looking mostly at that score. And so if someone has a strong quant score, even if the scores on the other 2 parts, integrative reasoning and verbal, are not as strong, the school is usually satisfied to see a solid quantitative reasoning score. That is usually interpreted as 10 to 12 or above on the quant. And so integrative reasoning, if someone doesn't do well on that, currently it's not a deal breaker because the school just puts more weight on the quantitative reasoning score. But if you did poorly on both quant and IR in the executive assessment, then that would be raising more flags about whether your skills are in place for the program. So now let's talk specifically what score is ideal for the top EMBA programs. I'm giving you a breakdown here. And so sometimes the schools do publish their averages. And so this may vary a bit from what they have on the website. And it's because this is what I find is actually the functional score that can get people in. And that's seen as part of a holistic application that is strong. So for most candidates, 150 plus with quant of 10 is usually viable at most of the top 10 EMBA programs. 152 quant of 10 to 12 is safer for those top 10 EMBA programs. And then 155 with a quant of 12 to 14 is better for Wharton. Wharton does pretty much have the highest standard in terms of where they want the executive assessment because they do have a very quantitative program. By school, I'll break it down a bit more. Wharton EMBA 155 plus is a solid score. Columbia EMBA 148 to 152, Booth 150 plus, Haas EMBA 149 to 152 plus. And Wharton, I do want to clarify, we get plenty of people into Wharton with lower than 155. So if I get someone coming to me with 146 and they say, I want to apply to Wharton EMBA, I'm not really concerned because I know there's lots we can do to establish their strong skills in other ways. But this is just a broad guideline as to where you might want to be aiming. For overrepresented profiles, things are a bit different. And so I do want to specify that for Wharton, they normally will want a 157 or above, quant of 14 or above. And then for most other top 10, 152 is fine, quant of 12 or so. And so keep those broad guidelines in mind as you are thinking about where to score. Is your score good enough? And so what about full-time MBA programs? They have not been taking the executive assessment very long. So the data is limited right now in terms of what they're really looking for. But most of the schools do indicate 155 or above with quant of 12 to 14 should be competitive. For overrepresented profiles, again, many times that's men who will be considered foreign nationals from East or South Asia, then 160 and above, quant of 14 to 16. I want to give you a sense of what a question looks like. So here's a sample quant question. It's actually not very difficult. So I think, the key thing is practicing, but I believe that most people who are, at the executive level or strong with the full-time pool would be able to practice well and do fine on answering a question like this. And here's a sample sentence correction question. Again, practice would probably allow most people to be able to respond to a question like this fine. So how to prepare? I always tell people the first thing is knowledge is power. So figure out where you are And so go to the website, which is for the executive assessment, mba.com. And you should consider purchasing one of their bundles because they will give you practice questions as well as 4 exams, practice exams. 2 of them are official. And what you want to do is, well, actually, these days they say 4 were artificial, which is good because when they had made it up in the past, sometimes people would get pretty inaccurate scores. So what you want to do is potentially purchase one of these packages, start to practice, take one of those exams, one of the official practice assessments, and see where you score. And then you're going to have a sense of, well, how much more studying do you need to do? Are you pretty far away? You got a 140, and so you know you need to improve quite a bit. Or did you score a 155 and things are looking good and you don't need too much more additional practice? And so know where you are, and from there you make decisions about, do I need to take a prep course? Is self-study going to be sufficient? And then move forward from there. But it's a good starting place. So again, you have the link at the top where you can go to look through the bundles and decide if you want to purchase one of these. And then people will ask, well, what if I get stuck in the 140s? Is that the end of my quest to have an executive MBA, or is that the end of my quest at the full-time level? And in some ways, it's 2 different questions. So here I'm addressing the executive MBA candidate, and I'm just saying that the EA is it's one component of a comprehensive application. And at the executive MBA level, you are defined by your professional success at that point. So that generally is going to be weighed the heaviest. But if you're able to isolate a bad EA score by showing excellence in all the other main areas, from professional success, your GPA undergrad, extracurricular success, then it's going to make the executive assessment less important, and you can actually offer other metrics to show I have strong skills in place. So whether that's a certification like CFA, or if it's a recent course that was quantitative and you did well, then you can point them to other metrics. And so as an example, we've helped people with a 146 into Wharton EMBA, 138 into Columbia EMBA, 141 into the EMBA Global Program. And so again, it's when the whole application has been crafted excellently, that means essays, resume, recommendations, then it's possible to isolate that EA and essentially overwrite it. In the full-time pool, it's less straightforward. So if you do get stuck with a low score on the executive assessment, you're going to really just have to decide, do you move? So say you take it 4 times and you just couldn't budge out of that 140s range. Do you move over to GMAT or GRE and try to see if you do better? But it does weigh more heavily in the full-time program. And so I would say that it's less easy to override a bad EA score in the full-time pool than in the executive MBA pool. And so you're just going to have to take it as it comes. And, if you exhaust your opportunities for the executive assessment, then move to the GRE or the GMAT and see if you can get a better score. So please like our video, and please come over to our website and send us your LinkedIn profile, a recent resume, or fill out the profile evaluation form if you would like us to let you know what we think about your candidacy, either to a top executive MBA program or to a top full-time program. So now I'm going to take some Q&A. So if I get any questions, I'm more than happy to talk about that. So I'm actually moving over to see if I can get the screen where the questions pop up. Give me a second. Let's see here. Okay. All right. So what is the lowest EA score I've seen, and where did the person gain admission? I think the lowest I've seen so far has been about a 136, and the person got admitted to Columbia Executive MBA program. So again, the person had a tremendous success. It was a woman who was a managing director in a private equity fund. So very rare that a woman gets to that level in that sort of organization. And so we were able to just craft a great application for her, and she's able to do well there. Another question. If someone gets a low EA score on the first try, do they usually go up on a second try? I wouldn't actually say that there's any trend. It's such an individual question. And so I think when someone has had a strong quantitative background, either in their undergraduate training or in their workplace, if they didn't do well on the first try, sometimes it's just an issue of pacing or something went wrong in terms of maybe they took it online and there was a proctoring issue. Sometimes it can be as minor as they're taking the test and they move their mouth during the program and the proctor says stop, and so they lose time and they don't do well. So that's for a person who has a strong foundation. If they do go into take it a second time, yes, you can see a big jump in their performance. But for some other candidates, it stays pretty flat to their frustration. So I do have a couple candidates who are kind of stuck around 148 or so. But the schools at the executive level are still being very welcoming to them. So, after some point, you'll know whether or not you have a better score in you, whether you actually think you can get it higher because whether, you just did your best and that's just where the score is. And so you will just decide based on how it went, pacing, your knowledge base, whether or not it's worth another try. So I have a question about online versus the test center with the EA, which is better. The test center is a more controlled environment. So on the whole, I would say if you can get into a center, it's probably better. Fewer things can go wrong. When it's online, you can have technical problems. More often than not, if something goes wrong, it's an issue of proctoring. So as I mentioned, if the proctor feels that you went out of view for a second, or if they feel that you moved your mouth, they might stop you. And the time that you lose, even if it's 30 seconds, is pretty significant in terms of impact on your performance. And so more of those things can come up in the online process than in the center. So if someone has a choice and they're equally convenient, I often do say just go ahead and go in the center. So let me see, maybe one more questions here. Do I think more schools are going to take the executive assessment over time? Full time is what I think the person means. That's really hard to say. I think at the present moment, among the top schools, I don't think you're going to see that. However, in the undergraduate pool, there is a movement to sort of get rid of standardized tests because they think it levels the playing field and it will open the doors to more underrepresented minorities, because the idea is that people who have more money or more privileged have more opportunities to take courses, get tutors, and do better on those standardized tests. So if that starts to filter into the full-time program, you might see more schools go to the executive assessment or just kind of give test waivers. So we'll just have to see as time goes by. But the fact that you have schools like Columbia full-time program accepting the executive assessment is great. And we have seen people get into the full-time program at Columbia with executive assessment scores. And the one candidate of mine last year who did that, she was a great example of when to turn to the executive assessment. She just could not get a strong GMAT score. So she was stuck around 620. And that's just not an ideal range for Columbia full-time. And so she switched over to the executive assessment, scored a 158, and gained admission with scholarship. So that was great. I see one or two more questions. I'll take this one last question. Is the EA fairly easy as compared to the GMAT? And yes, comparatively speaking, yes. And as you see, the sample questions I showed you, they were not very difficult. It really is practice will allow you to do well on it. And it is designed to require minimal study. So yes, it is easier. And so based on your profile and what type of program you're applying to, you would just decide, is the executive assessment a good option? Is it risky option? And again, it's pretty much only risky in the full-time pool if you have a poor GPA, for example, because the school would probably want to see you perform better on the GMAT. All right, I'm going to leave it at that. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out to me at my website. I'm more than happy to respond. But good luck as you continue on your MBA or executive MBA journey. And thanks for joining us today.